Okay, so we're ready to begin. Hi, Hani, and hello, everyone. So our speaker for this session, Hani Nabeel, is an ace with technology and behavioral science. He is the chief behavioral scientist at Eyesight Tech, a leading global people analytics and behavioral science company. Being the founder of the award-winning Culturescope, he combines the best elements of scientific and practical organizational research with a special focus on organizational culture. With over 20 years of experience in this field, who better than him to tell us about the science of cracking culture code? So without further ado, over to you, Hani.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's hopefully I'll live up to this great introduction and great to be with you and the NowFest family. I'll share my screen so that we can tell the world about Culturescope. So Culturescope was born for exactly that need to crack the culture code. It was born out of 7-year study, a fairly large quantitative behavior analytics and diagnostic study to answer for that word culture. When I say large, it was over 51,000 participants across 60 diverse organizations within 61 countries. And as we launched and started doing some great things with it, we won a notice by Wharton, who kind of lead the world in our people analytics environment. And they graced us with this great award, which we're very thankful for. Now, let's talk a little bit before we show off some of the elements of how we measure. Let's take you through a quick journey of understanding how Culturescope works. If you can imagine just a question like the one I'm posing on the screen, for any organization of any size, whatever you do, knowing culture is fit for purpose is very hard. You know, you can really put that for any leader, any executive, any person in any organization. It's very hard to articulate. And ultimately, what we really want to simplify to say, look, culture should be your best ally at driving great things, but also keeping you out of trouble. Whoever you are, whatever type of company you are, you want your culture to enable people to do great things. But you want to manage risk. There's no amount of rule and regulations and process that will help you alone if you don't pay special care to culture and building the right culture. And if you do that, you do get something back. If you balance risk and reward, you're going to please your customers, your employees, and certainly do right by shareholders and certainly serve the community that you serve very well. So if culture has been for years really critical, and organizational culture is often on the news, wherever you look, whether it be it the financial services industry, the automotive, the airline industry, or, I mean, it really has been the villain. So how do we make it the hero? And the first step is we got to be able to measure it. What you can't measure, you can't fix. So if we really understand culture measurement, it's about behavior. Culture is simply how things get done in any place. When I've asked many organizations, how do you measure culture? A lot talk about measuring performance, measuring employee engagement. All of that is wonderful, but these are the outcomes of culture. Many psychologists in the room, whether it be Edgar Schein or many other, have told us, look, culture is about behavior. It's the leading indicator. So it was rather unusual that we only measure the output and never the input. And hence why Culturescope was really born out of behavioral, quantitative behavior study first. And I'm sharing with you that middle question because it's important. You know, behavior is quite dynamic. It's not as fixed as personalities. Are we influenced by the environment that we're in, or do we influence the environment that we're in? We could really articulate the answer to that question in two distinct ways. If you think about country culture, ethnography, it does simply cast itself on our behaviors, full stop. You know, you can probably land anywhere on the planet, open up your eyes, you probably observe people's behaviors, you know where you are, right? And that's what I mean. It's deep-rooted system. You really can't change that. It's very hard to change it. Organizationally being the lower order, and now there is an important perpetual relationship between the place and its people, but they do drive each other. You can imagine certain leaders might drive certain reward systems, even as an example, or the way they behave themselves to drive behavior change at the place, and people will hopefully over time enact that out really and change. And just because it is important to measure both of those to answer for the word of culture, normally we just try and measure behaviors of people, but when I talk about the place, we talk about what are the processes and the systems and the policies and even the environmental space that actually works on our behaviors. So what is it that we observe around us to try and explain that system we live in? And how do I live within that system for each person? So the diagnostic is important. A valid scientific diagnostic is important. I'll talk about that for just a few seconds because I really want to move to the analytics, which is, I guess, where it will be quite exciting to share with you some interesting results. For us, it's a non-invasive diagnostic. It's the best non-invasive diagnostic. It's an online questionnaire. There's 2 of them, and each person in any large organization, anything from 300 to 300,000, gets invited to complete this online diagnostic. It is fundamentally very different, and the reason being, it uses forced choice scenario-based questions. At work, are you focused on what's A, real, B, possible? Is an example. There's no right and wrong. And it uses what is known as item response theory, which is a matrix of 5 or 3 behaviors on the screen. You have to indicate what you do most of and least of. The exciting part is we deliver all of this in a dynamic fashion. It's not static. We use computer adaptive testing. So every person responding to the diagnostic in real time is actually connected to the brain in real time, and it will deploy more different questions, less questions to drive validity. The whole point is to get an objective, unbiased view of what I do and what I observe. It's a very efficient way of also collecting 30 factors of behavior, which is what we do in just an average 12 minutes. And we deliver that today, by the way, in possible 11 languages. So it's a valid and quantitative measure of how things get done. If you're an avid psychometrician, you'd love this, of course, but we don't want to talk too much about this because it's what we do with the data that is quite important. So without further ado, let's talk about the analytics. We collected this valid data. What do we do with it? Imagine now you go to any organization of any size, 3, 4, 5,000, 10,000, doesn't matter. And for each you collect how do they behave versus what they observe. What we really have collected here is what has been happening when we talk about the place. How do I do things when it's the how in the formula. And now you can build some very interesting trend analysis and matrices to understand why people do what they do. Is it the place? Who's driving what? And we can go and show this data to lots of organizations, colleagues and people, and we might get excited about it, but of course they'll go, well, so what? Is this good or bad? It's just behavioral data. We just don't know if it's interesting. And they're absolutely right. So we bring in a third bucket for our analytics, which is unique to each organization, which is the context, their environment, their outcomes. It could really fall in 3 areas, whether it be at their HR demographic data, gender, tenure, job position, location, that sort of thing, or any sort of KPI, any sort of performance indicators they look at, or even event-driven outcomes, right? From incidents, accidents, you know, or even sentiment data, how our customers feel about us, how employees feel about us. Essentially, what we're doing here is connect the stuff that they've got today and they look at, which is the lagging indicators connected because it's their people and their behavior that make things happen, to the leading indicators. And when we do that, we do a number of things. We can now deliver actionable insight, right? What are the behaviors that really you need to do to live your values and frameworks or drive outcomes? Or we could look at it outcome first, and through variate analyses and regression analyses, we can actually identify which are the behaviors that really predict these outcomes. So you get to know what you get, you know, if we're going to change, we're going to drive behavior change, what do we get back for our programs? Which I'll show you examples for today. So we go from left to right or right to left to really deliver the whole insight. The whole point is if you have a data stream that talks about how your people behave at work, it's your people that make things happen, no surprise. We can now have a thematic view to culture. So really, for instance, bring in any compliance and risk management outcomes connected so we understand the people behavior impact on that, or financial and cyber crime, or connecting culture and strategy, driving a learning culture, driving innovation, which is quite important. We know how innovation is important from a culture perspective, or driving transformation, or even well-being, which is critical in today's world we find ourselves in. Inclusion, I'll tell you what, we always talk diversity, and I wish I could uncouple diversity and inclusion from each other as words. Diversity is easy to measure, we focus on it, right? How many different genders we have, different ethnic backgrounds we have. However, are we an inclusive organization or not? It's a behavior, and that's what we shine a light on as an inclusion, as a behavior. And because you can segment the data, understand cultures and subcultures related to performance, and needless to say, how to protect shareholder value post M&A, which sadly it gets destroyed because of culture. And culture is often the villain when it comes to post M&A. And one client who is very vocal about HSBC is HSBC, about our work. We've done a lot of work around the world, but what they have particularly challenged us with is for 300,000 employees, 71 countries, how can we basically understand culture that stamps out as an example on financial crime and improve our efficiencies and performance. And we've done a big project with them, which was just in 5 weeks across all 71 countries. They decided to share the results with the world, which is quite exciting. What I'm sharing with you on the screen is an extract from their governance report in April 18, where they dedicated to a page to Culturescope, talking about, look, we know how we live our own values, and not only that, we know what we're good at, and we know what we need to improve on, which is what you see down here through predictive analytics. So really, before I give you a couple of quick, interesting case studies, what makes Culturescope unique is really what we need to see in behaviors measurement. If we are focusing on culture, we do need to have a behavior measurement approach. So behavior science becomes critical. You've got to have a valid measurement. We measure both individual and organizational behaviors. How do I behave? What I observe around me. And uniquely for each organization, link it to their own outcomes, their own context. In that way, we can deliver actionable insight to say, we want to improve innovation. What behaviors do we need to focus on? We want to improve speak up culture. What behaviors do we need to achieve? There's no point just talking about them in arbitrary terms, but also give them predictive analytics, right? Going forward, if you do these behaviors, what do I get back for my money? I'm going to share with you some examples, because that's the best way of bringing it quickly to life here. And I thought, well, we talk about the power of predictive, because we tend to look at culture with a rear view mirror. Now we're going to look at it forwards. So let me give you a couple of examples on predictive analytics to bring it to life. So shining a light here quickly on the base measurement. So I talked before, you may have heard me, about 30 factors. So basically in Culturescope world, we measure 30 factors of behavior, organized in dichotomy. So there are 15 dimensions, if you like. They're a whole continuum. That was born out of, actually, we didn't assume anything. Early on our research, we measured 229 behaviors first, but now we know that these 30 behaviors do matter in the context of culture and predictive to outcome. But you can imagine presenting an image, this looks lovely, it means nothing. But now there are some key questions. For instance, in the example I gave you, I'm going to give you now, which of those behaviors drive performance? Which of those behaviors drive speak up culture? Right? Which of those behaviors drive innovation even? We don't know that when we look at this. So let's bring this to life. So here's a predictive model that we've done for one of our clients. For 11,411 employees, they gave us a relevant outcome around speak up, which was a hard metric around speak up volume and severity of incidents that they monitor. But also they had a sentiment item in their engagement survey where they asked people, typically where I work, people can state their opinion without fear of negative consequence. 1 to 5 being a Likert scale from I totally agree to totally disagree. And we really don't know, of course, how can we improve our speak up volume and certainly improve people's opinion on the ability they can. But mixing it in with Culturescope in the same buckets, we bring in all 30 factors of place, 30 of people. Out pops the answer with regression and modeling to say that predictor is the place in the context of speak up makes sense. And actually the key behaviors that predict those outcomes are people focus out of about 30 factors: people focus, expressive, and conformity. Essentially, I speak up for the sake of our people and our customers. I freely express an opinion, and I obey the rules and regulations and treat people fairly based on these rules. How good of a predictor that is. And of course, it's very easy in terms of particularly the world of statistics to go into complex modeling. And we try and simplify this in odds ratio to give them a true meaning of why they need to worry for these behaviors, to a diagram that looks like this. Basically, those three nested behaviors that I spoke about, being people focus, expressive, apologies, so it's people focus, expressive, and conformity. Basically, where those three behaviors are on the upper quartile of what people observe, they are 26 times more likely to achieve those two outcomes they told us. So you can see we've gone really to give them a predictor now, saying just focus on those three and you're 26 times more likely to achieve the desired outcomes. However, if you have those behaviors present but weak, you're already working twice against those outcomes. And of course, that could be any sort of outcome. The one here they were interested in was specifically for speak up. I could give you a quick one on building trust. And again, that is a sentiment one, which is still quite interesting. Building trust in organizations is quite critical these days. And a lot of time you'd find people plant this kind of question in their engagement survey, which is I trust senior leaders in my area, but we don't know why people trust and don't. But look at this. Mixing it in with behavior analytics, we can say now to managers and leaders, listen up, team focus, active learning, conformity, focus on your team, on their learning, and treat people fairly. And guess what? You are 82 times more likely that people will agree with that statement, that I do trust senior leaders in my area. We can predict even where those behaviors are present. We're 82 times more likely to drive trust versus only twice more likely where those behaviors are absent. And again, if you're interested in numbers, this is over just over 6,900, almost 7,000 people. So we're talking about large sample sizes that we're showing you here. Likewise, and I'll give you another one on well-being and then move on, is the ability these days to drive well-being. And there are many, many outcomes that you could look at really, whether be it how long people stay at work, last minute leave. They also gave us an example for a sentiment item being my direct line manager takes my well-being into consideration. This is, can be predicted now with all behaviors, being people focus, active learning, conformity, and expressive. These are the 4 factors that predict whether people will respond positively to that or not. And if you wonder by how much, look at this, they are 28 times more likely where they observe this behavior to respond positively to, yes, my direct line manager does care for my well-being. The whole point of showing you these outcomes is then we can give them a connection between those outcomes. So we call that path analysis. Under the hood, if you like, your mathematics and structure equation modeling. And path analysis does this. Say, look, if you want to improve all of those outcomes, actually, we can give you a path to greatness. Here's the composite for personal behaviors and organizational behaviors. Go to trust first. That's what you need to do. Don't think about anything else. Behaviors that drive trust. And really, if you go and get trust right, there's a huge impact on speak up. You got to dial in more behaviors here at the organization to drive speak up. And if you're investing time in well-being here, don't worry, because if you drive trust and speak up, you're going to get well-being anyway. So suddenly going from let's work on everything to let's focus on what do we work for second, third, and fourth. Think about behavioral roadmap change. That becomes a critical discussion. Let's visit with the same data for driving performance and value creation. And hopefully a lot of question becomes like this, is which of our teams, and from a culture point of view and behavior point of view, are actually driving performance? And I'm going to show you 2 groups here, and you'll see why then you can make a decision and which really behaviors to choose from. So group 1, and basically what we're saying is if in that group they exhibit delivery focus, individual relationship, behavioral factors, they are 9.5 times more likely to achieve high performance. Okay, let's look at group 2, achieving the same high level performance. So let's go, apologies here, there you go. And in group 2, where we have delivery focus, expressive, active learning, innovate, and relationship behavioral factors, is 24 times more likely to achieve high performance. So now that you've seen which behaviors really drive performance for group 1 or group 2, there are some similar things, which is really delivery focus here. The rest is different, and you can say, well, model 2 certainly looks a lot better, and guess what? I'd much rather drive 25 times more likely to drive performance than I am really with just 8 times. And another interesting one using the same data is to think about that important question, is how do we drive innovation? And I'll show you here, I'm borrowing from Charles Dickens now, there you go, a tale of two companies. And a tale of two companies goes like this. So if you can look at company 1, where they have been investing millions in innovation or driving digital innovation, but have been failing. And then we understand it from an organizational perspective through variate and regression analysis for this company, that really to drive new product, new path for innovation, it's about behaviors for innovate. Conformity, we're still not going to break the rules, be flexible, be radical, be strategic, think about the long term, synchronous, trying multiple ways of working, and even out of focus. So what you'd see here is the collection of those behaviors. We found that people that can drive innovate by culture, but this place firmly works against innovate. In fact, the place wants to drive standardized, moderate, consolidate. So it's really is innovators versus the place. No shock here, although they're investing millions. Are they getting anything back for it? Absolutely not. Look at company B in the same space like company A is. They're investing millions, but they're winning awards. They just won 3 awards for products innovation. And if you wonder why, look at the difference here. It really is an alignment between the place and its people. The place is even ahead in that master indicator. And if you wonder why, innovate as a behavior is ahead of the place, and radical is a behavior that's also ahead. So now that you've seen that, you've seen the predictor, which we can go outcome first, but also what we tell organizations is you can also now live your own frameworks. You know, if innovate is part of your values, you know what behaviors you need to achieve to live your values for driving values-based culture. So I'll leave it and open it up for lots of questions that you may have. I'll leave you with the thought that really we have a simple mission. We want to use behavioral science and predictive analytics to help organizations deliver the immeasurable. They've never been able to measure culture. They don't even have a culture plan. So if we can deliver insights and predictive analytics on what drives performance and minimizes risk, we give them the ability suddenly to really turn culture to being the hero rather than, sadly, it's often the villain at the moment.
Hi, Hani. We are just waiting for the questions to come in. Give us a couple of minutes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No
Guys
problem.
who are listening in to us on YouTube, on Facebook, and on LinkedIn, now is the time. We saw a couple of comments out there, so please start sharing your questions, and Hani is going to be taking them up. Our team is scouting for the questions out there on those 3 channels. Prefer LinkedIn Live, but YouTube is cool too. All love to Facebook also. So guys, have your questions coming up. Meanwhile, Hani, thank you so much for for those fantastic insights. And if I had to talk about something simple, while we wait for questions to pop in, where do you see all of it going? Like, what is the future gonna look like? I think that we leave you with that one question while you have people asking more questions.
Yeah. So that's a very insightful question. Very good. Basically, the future is about culture can be helped significantly if we can measure it through behavior analytics. What we tend to have done before is try and use many different but ineffective ways of measuring culture and think we are measuring culture, i.e. the outcomes of culture. So we try and measure sentiment or employee engagement or how well we're doing, but we forget the leading indicator being behavior. So if we bring proper behavior measurement and a qualitative measurement and really start studying and understanding how culture is unique in your own organization and how it drives its own outcomes to build your own benchmarks, we can help organizations start building a culture plan, or even do something significant, which is culture by design. You know, be brave and design what is really the culture you want to have? And now you could do this in a more effective way because you have a metric that actually eludes what are the behaviors you need and how are they likely to impact your outcomes going forward. And it really changes the whole discussion around, well, we're unsure about culture. It's a hearsay. We never had even a culture plan. I mean, most organizations will have a financial plan, will have a product plan, they will have a talent plan sometimes, and fail to even have a culture plan. So that's where I want to take the future. And that way, we can indeed, culture becomes our ally. It becomes the hero, not the villain. Sadly, I know now there are so many stories on the news in many industries where culture has sadly always been the villain.
Ali, thank you so much for that. We have one question popping up from Advik Raj on YouTube. Advik's question is, how do you translate, and I'm checking out on the YouTube screen out here, right? We're streaming on multiple platforms.
Thank you.
How do you, well, thank you. And thanks to all the audience who have logged in from all the different time zones. At some point of time, we find out how many, but I think it's like in tens of thousands already. But I digress. Advik's question is, how do you translate these recommendations, which are rather vague, like in quotes, learn focus, for example, to a more detailed or a contextually optimal recommendation? All yours.
Sure. Yeah, you have to take the insights into a program to make it effective. And a lot of organizations we work with, we start designing, particularly if you think about active learning as an example. So how are we going to drive that at the place is one question. So that's what we call place interventions. And how do we expect people to exhibit that behavior? And that behavior is all about, in our world, active learning is about, I learn because it's right for my job. I'm learning something actively in order to drive a better way of working. And that's where we separate interventions in two to make it happen. Sadly, believe it or not, when we used to design interventions, we tend to focus at the person and forget the place. And if we don't fix the place as well as help people in that behavior shift, what happens is the training goes nowhere because people, when they're back in the place, they default back to the place. So the way that we're making it happen successfully is design the place to help that behavior and then also the individuals to focus on that behavior. And you get far more success once you do it in that approach. Again, up till now, we kind of rarely done that. We've never designed organizations that really are about the people. We design it as if it's not run by people, which is strange.
We have been known to speak about how do you operationalize it with a tech support and talk to the entire world listening to it. So we're being doubly cautious now. But then the question here is from Cecilia Kabir, and I hope I got the name right. How are the behaviors in the matrix being operationalized? That's the question.
Sorry, sorry, say the question.
How are the behaviors in the matrix?
Yes.
Being operationalized? That is the question.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Got you. So for each organization, although we measure those 30, obviously not 30 are relevant for every organization. So the first approach is to understand which behaviors, which aspects of their culture drives their key outcomes. Because once you get that, that's the first answer. Is it the place or is it the people? What are they good at, not good at? And now you need to, if you want to put it from an operational point of view, it is what are especially we're going to do that is relevant to each organization that is going to drive those behaviors. I go back to the behavior nudge theory. So let me operationalize it just to give an example here, to be realistic. For one organization that they were trying to improve the amount they recycle, paper recycling, right? Simple stuff, right? Really simple. So leaders were thinking, yeah, if I just go ahead and show to others that I am actually taking this seriously and I will put my paper recycling bin, it will work. And yes, it will kind of, they'll see you do it, they might do it. But here's your problem. You need to put a recycling bin facility, you know, one of small bin, large bin, whatever it is, everywhere, all around the offices, because people aren't going to leave the first floor, go to the third floor in order to exhibit that behavior, although they see you doing it. So to operationalize it, quote unquote, yes, leaders and people need to do it, but you need to design the environment to help nudge that behavior. And that's how you bring it to reality. I hope that kind of brings it to life.
Thank you, Hani. I have another question, and this question has popped up from many people. So I'm not able to put up one particular name to this, but to all of them who asked this question, really interesting one. How does ethics play a part in using data analytics to drive behavioral change?
We are very respectful of confidentiality, and also especially in Europe now with GDPR compliance, as you might imagine. So in Culturescope world, we are trying to understand behavior trend analysis rather than look at one individual. So in fact, we never cut data to produce analytics of only less than 5. It's n equals 5 and above. And the beauty of this is once you have behavioral data and driving culture from an ethics point of view, many leaders choose to share that with the community, with the people they lead. Because then when they say, look, this is what we are, this is what we do, and we need to change what we do, actually, it's a lot more interesting that people buy into that. The problem is if you just as a leader stand and say, well, this is what we do and I have no evidence for it, people won't buy into that. So from an ethical perspective, we are not interested in their name, their shoe size, or any of that. It's about just understanding the behavior analytics and the predictor to help organization really quantify what behaviors they need to work on and what's the outcome.
Hani, thank you so much. I have a lot more questions coming up. By the way, that particular question was from Abhishek and Alessandra. Here is another question from Mayura Sandeep, who says, Mayura Sandeep says, do you see scope for usage in the social sector?
We have done some interesting studies where I've worked at country level with United Nations development programs that they were deploying this with a certain country to start understand the social behaviors. So what might be happening? And if you think at government level, kind of, you've got mass amounts of behavioral data, and they tend to tell us a story about what happens socially. So we started understanding that a little bit at that level, particularly in the fight of the famous COVID issue that we're on now. Is there a connection between how we behave and the spread of that disease? Of course, we're finding the answer is yes, we know that. But it's early on studies to try and understand if we're going to create social change and behavior change, what behaviors do we really need to nudge to do that? Because if we can do it en masse across different, I'm not saying the public sector, government sector, it really presents the country as a whole, but it gives us a sample size to start going there and beyond the social effects.
Thank you. We have another question here. This is from Jazguru. How do you convince the C-suite that culture ROI is tangible, both positively and negatively, and what types of organizations are most receptive to this?
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Okay. So if you think about it, the reality is if you walk to board directors and C-suite, if you're in HR typically, and talk about culture in really non-defined, uncertain terms, they'll throw you out because they're used to figures and numbers, right? All boards love figures and numbers. If you are specific about here is how we live our values, here are the behaviors that we exhibit that live our values, and here is the outcome, right? And the predictors, which is what I showed you. I mean, these are strong predictors in simple language that shows why we need to focus on culture change or even maintain. Even if we need to maintain our culture, great. Or do we need a culture change? But you have a metric for culture and behavior. You are far more likely to get audience that will listen, and especially at C-suite, who really could say, look, you're accountable for culture these days. I've got a measurement for you, and do not ignore it, because if you ignore it, this is the opportunity you're missing. And the people that are most able to listen and change are leaders who do lead with culture first. I go back to the famous culture eat strategy for breakfast. It really does. If you go right into the background, you never fail on strategy. unfortunately, is you fail on implementation. Culture is how you're going to deliver on strategy, if strategy is what you're going to deliver. So most leaders who do care for culture, because they do know it is the how you're going to deliver, will absolutely listen and take note and take key responsibility in driving the behavior change they need.
There's a question here from Patrick who says, do you also track behaviors like retention?
Absolutely, behavior change or behavior retentions. We do track all of this, and the reason for tracking is if you measure, some things you do want to retain and some you do want to change. So behavior retention might be quite important even for staff retention or talent retention, especially in a lot of parts of the world in key talent areas where, you know, in the talent war. And there is a significant connection we're finding between talent retention, behavior retention, and really culture. So absolutely, you've got to keep an eye out for that. What the problem is, what you can't measure, you can't track, and you can't retain, leave alone change. So for our, you know, the key element is having a valid method to measure.
Hani, I got two questions here, Hani. I'm gonna mix the two of them together. One is from Sujit Joshi. Second is from Smriti. Sujit says, since the term culture comprises of different things for different people,
yeah,
how do you handle diversity in culture while measuring it? So that's his question. The other question from Smriti, and I'm trying to mix them together because they might have similar answers, but you know better. Culture isn't something stagnant, it's dynamic in nature, I feel. Then how do we go about it? The cause and effect relationship will definitely change. So first goes around diversity, how do you measure it? Second is about being very dynamic in nature. So your point of view, please.
Sure. Yeah. So let me address the first one because it is an important one. Measuring culture and behavior is not, and it should not be seen as working against diversity. Let me demonstrate at country level what I mean by this. Let's visit, I don't know, let's go to China for a minute. You know, there's 1.4 billion people in China. Now, I hope you'd agree there's 1.4 different personalities. They are all unique, but yet there are some things they all do that binds them together. The way they give business cards, the way they eat, you know, with chopsticks, whatever. So these are prevalent behaviors that at a country level happen. Yet, you know, they're all different personalities. So what we're saying here is there are prevalent behaviors that makes up an organization, the DNA of who we are. It doesn't matter we're all the same. And when diversity measurement comes in, the problem is we chase, oh, we have people with lots of ethnic backgrounds. Aren't we brilliant? Or we have people, we have different genders now in our leadership group. Aren't we great? But are we actually inclusive to all? So if you think about inclusion, is the place collective to all the same way? Active learning happens the same way. Conformity happens to all of us the same way. Achievement happens to all of us the same way, irrespective of what my beliefs are, my color. So we are driving inclusion rather than just keep focusing on the metric of diversity. I'm not saying it's not important, but diversity for the sake of diversity. And I normally say, and this will make you laugh, if you have diversity without inclusion, it's like eating soup with a fork. You're going to go very hungry, right? Because you can try and drive diversity, but people will leave. There's no point. The second question is exactly true. Behavior is very dynamic. It's not as fixed as personalities. Our behaviors change. We know that, right? You know that your personality is somewhat fixed, but during your lifetime, your career, you can imagine your behaviors have changed from going from one company to another. What do? You walk in, the first few days, you got your culture radar on, what's allowed around here. You observe people behave, you start mimicking those behaviors. Either you feel comfortable, you carry on, or you leave, by the way, but essentially behavior is dynamic. So that's why we say you got to measure behaviors every 6 months, because culture is dynamic. Every time there's a significant change in the world, significant change in the market, you've got to measure behaviors, because yes, it can have a huge immediate impact on behavior. Just think about the world we're in now, the fact that you and I are holding even this conference in the way that we are. See, COVID globally, was the biggest behavior nudge. I was just talking to a big client around the world just before this call we have, of how much they're changed or they're driven for them to be innovate, to change the way they're working because of COVID, while there were certain things they couldn't dream of doing a few months ago, literally. So yes, it is dynamic, and that's what's going to be monitored.
All right, Nabeel, we have time for one last question, but there are a lot of questions out there. Let me pick up one last one. I'm going to again mix two questions, right?
Yeah.
Number one is this question from Jhalak Malhotra. She says, "Hi, Mr. Nabeel, I have a question. Certain people have different views than the majority. So how do you make sure the environment is inclusive?" That's number one from Jhalak. And then you have a question from Farah Usman. Says, "How do you best convince a restricted society or client to initiate, behavior change when they don't want to talk about the negative behaviors? They refuse to see the elephant in the room or address it, right?" So two questions, but kind of tied out there. This will be our last questions of all yours.
Yeah, they are true. So in two things we do whenever we talk about Culturescope from an analytics validity. If we're aiming for statistical validity, we say, okay, we've got to have a certain percentage in order to drive that. But I always talk about analytics validity. Analytics validity is the following. If you have a small group in your organization who are 5 or 6 people who tell you something very different about the behaviors that happen to them and how they behave within 300,000, do not ignore that. Do not ignore that. So analytics validity means that, everyone matters. And that's why I sometimes battle against organizations say, yeah, but, this benchmark here where something is really wrong is only 7 or 10 people and we are like, 100,000. I say, yeah, perfect. So it's okay for the 100,000, but there is something there. Just there, look here at this benchmark. It's telling you something is substantially different. Do not ignore it. That's where issues can brew up. Lo and behold, that's sometimes where big incidents can happen. Just happens at that level. So do not ignore, and that's how you can become inclusive in that. And when you talk about behavior change, the second part, look, the hardest thing you'll achieve and can be the simplest thing you can achieve is behavior change. We make it hard for ourselves because we never think about designing rewards, designing furniture, even the designing organizations, designing jobs around people behavior. We just, for some reason, have been divorcing this as if organizations aren't run by people. So when you want to drive behavior change, I normally say, start with the place, because you ain't going to achieve that if the place does not promote that. And what I mean is just think about if we drive certain rewards for the behaviors we want, how that will be a big ally in behavior change. Bring in behavioral champions, know who they are, and allow them to really drive their own behavior agenda by using a champion approach. How brilliant that is.
Thank you, Hani. We have more questions coming, but
time's up.
Run out of time. And thank you, Hani, to folks listening in. This wonderful person out here who had this fantastic point of views around cultures, insight, analytics. And if you have more questions, this is Hani Nabeel. And if you have more questions, on behalf of Hani, I'm just saying, feel free to ping him on LinkedIn, and question your questions, and let's make his weekend a little busy one. Let's give him some 40, 100, 200 questions to answer, guys. Thank you all very much. Hani, it's a pleasure knowing you, listening to you. Thank you so much.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you. Have a great day ahead.
You too.
Bye-bye, everybody.